Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In this week's podcast, we are continuing the story that marks the transition from a pronounced priestly ministry to a pronounced prophetic ministry in Israel. This is part 3 of this series. It focuses on 1 Samuel chapter 3. This chapter begins quite innocuously by letting us know that the lad, Samuel, was continuing his apprenticeship as a priest under Eli. That's in verse 1. The very next statement, however, is jarring. When Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli's tutelage, it was the case that, quote, the word of the Lord was rare in that era. This statement is further explicated by noting that, quote, there was no frequent vision, end of quote. That's in verse 2. What in the world does that mean? Briefly, it means that when Samuel was being tutored to perform priestly duties, it was a time when prophetic vision was desultory. That is, prophetic vision was infrequent. Why would we be told that in the context of a story that is promoting priesthood? We will soon have the answer to that question. Knowing that this episode takes place when prophetic vision is infrequent gives us knowledge about the general circumstance. But the next thing we come to know is much more local and specific. At that time, we are told, Eli had aged so that he did not see well. We will soon realize why Eli's eyesight is crucial to this narrative. Plus, we are informed about this during the night when both Eli and Samuel were sleeping. That's in verse 2. One more item is mentioned. We are told that a vessel referred to as the lamp of God had not yet gone out. This is a literal and metaphorical datum. Literally, it meant that the light on a nightstand was barely flickering. Metaphorically, it meant that there was at least a sliver of light in the temple where Eli and Samuel were sleeping. One more item is mentioned as well. We learn that the Ark of God was right there in the sanctuary. The Ark of God was a major symbol that underscored divine presence. Having set the stage, the narrative continues. All of a sudden, a divine voice is heard. The Lord had just called out Samuel's name. Actually, the Lord had said the name twice. Samuel, Samuel. That's in verse 4. When Samuel heard the voice, the lad immediately said, "Here I am." That immediate response is praiseworthy. Nevertheless, it turns out that Samuel did not know to whom the voice belonged. Therefore, he figured that Eli had called him. So he ran to Eli and announced once again, "Here I am." He even told Eli that he had ascertained that the old priest had summoned him. Eli knew that he had not called for Samuel, so he said as much and told the lad to go back to sleep. Samuel returned to his bed. That's in verse 5. The Lord called out a second time. Once again, Samuel heard the voice and went to Eli, announcing, "Here I am because you called me." That's in verse 6. Once more, Eli told Samuel that he had not called the lad. For a second time, Eli tells Samuel to go back to bed. At this point, the narration supplies a parenthetical statement in which it is pointed out that at this time, Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and that the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. This is a puzzling statement. How could it be that someone who is learning to be a priest does not know the Lord, whom he is serving? Likewise, why had not the Lord's word been revealed to Samuel? Would that not have been a prerequisite for priestly ministry? I suggest that these tropes, knowing the Lord and having the Lord's word revealed, are primarily prophetic tropes. Priests, of course, do know the Lord in one way, and also they know the Lord's word. Yet the prophetic ministry is very different. When one thinks of prophets, one simultaneously thinks of prophetic speech, oracles, prophetic symbols and metaphors, speech acts, and the like. It is that nuance that is, I believe, being communicated by the parenthetical phrase we are considering. In sum, we are being told that Samuel had not yet been called as or responded to as a prophet. That is about to change, however. In any case, the Lord calls Samuel for a third time. And for the third time, Samuel goes to Eli, thinking that the priest had called him. That's in verse 8. For Eli, the third time was the charm. Finally, it dawned on him that the voice Samuel was hearing belonged to the Lord. For that reason, he tells Samuel to go back to his room and, if he hears the voice again, respond by saying, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." That's in verse 9. Eli should be given credit for realizing that the Lord was summoning Samuel. At the same time, it is concerning that it took 3 times for this to dawn on Eli. It turns out that this priest's physical eyesight was dim, and his spiritual insight was equally dim. This is a thinly veiled criticism of the religious leadership that was being exercised in Israel at the time. Still, we need to keep in mind that the lamp of God had not yet gone out. There was still a glimmer of light. That glimmer has a chance of being brightened with God's calling of Samuel. We'll have to wait and see. Indeed, the Lord calls Samuel for a 4th time, and right on cue, Samuel responds expectantly. That's in verse 10. Then the Lord tells Samuel what the deity is about to do and what Samuel's role in that activity is. The Lord tells Samuel that what is about to transpire will be startling and unsettling. This is not good news. The Lord is about to bring judgment on Eli's priestly house. Eli's sins were not the problem, but his sons were beyond corrupt. What they did amounted to blasphemy. Yet Eli was unable to curb their behavior. That's in verse 13. Eli's house was, therefore, beyond redemption. No sacrifices would atone for these calculated sins. That's in verse 14. Given this level of divine judgment, the days for the priestly house of Eli were numbered. Samuel had the rest of the night to contemplate what the Lord had said. When he got up, he opened the doors of the house of the Lord. Once again, when Samuel opened these doors, he did something literally and metaphorically. Literally, he performed one of his regular duties by simply opening the door. Metaphorically, he now provided access to the house of the Lord instead of Eli. Samuel was about to replace his mentor and tutor. But God had told Samuel bad news about Eli. He was naturally afraid to deliver this news to the priest with whom he had been working for such a long time. Eli called him, and Samuel responded. Eli wanted to know what God had told his student. Under no circumstances was he to keep this message to himself, no matter how dire. With that prompting, Samuel told Eli everything. That's in verse 18. Eli readily accepted the Lord's verdict. He submitted himself into God's hands. Eli's only sin was being unable to get his sons to change their egregious behavior. Nevertheless, that inability spelled doom for his priestly house. In this segment, Samuel began ministering to the Lord under the mentorship of Eli. He was learning to be a priest. At this point, Samuel was growing. The Lord was with him, and the Lord did not let any of Samuel's words fall to the ground. That statement was a common prophetic figure of speech. Samuel began as a priest in 1 Samuel 3. Toward the end of that passage, he had become a prophet. Plus, this was no private affair. All Israel, from the extreme north to the extreme south, from Dan to Beersheba, knew that the Lord had established him as a prophet. That's in verse 20. Prophetic ministry was about to become dominant in Israel. This appearance that the Lord made to Samuel on that fateful night was only the beginning. The Lord appeared again at Shiloh. It turned out that the Lord appeared at Shiloh regularly for revelatory purposes. Samuel had responded to the call and had been established as a prophet in Israel. Let me to encourage you to go to my website, faspina.com, peruse it, enjoy it, let me know what your email is, and if you have a question that you'd like me to answer in a Q&A session, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. 1, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. 2, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.